Hi everyone, a pleasant morning. On behalf of the Ateneo University School of Government and Project Participate, we welcome you to the second leg of Halalan 2.0, holding free, fair, and safe elections in the new normal. Before we start, please be reminded of a few etiquettes to observe during the live event. To help keep background noise to a minimum, please make sure you mute your microphone and turn off your video cameras during the presentation, and when you are not speaking. If you have any questions, we will be having an open forum after the presentation. For others who are not comfortable asking their questions publicly, you may send a direct private message to the organizers, Mr. Dexter Yang, and or Mr. Jazz Malonda, or use the Q&A button found on the Zoom toolbar. Lastly, feel free to use the chat box to share your thoughts or opinions on the matter being discussed. Please be advised to observe courtesy and respect in the conversation. Bullying of any kind is not allowed, and disrespectful comments will not be tolerated. Any violation after first warning will merit an automatic eviction from the webinar. Self-promotion, spam, and irrelevant links are also not allowed. We invite everyone to follow our social media accounts on Facebook, facebook.com/ateneosog, facebook.com/participateph, or follow us on Twitter or Instagram at participate_ph. As we begin our webinar, we are proud to introduce our guest host and moderator for our session today. She graduated magna cum laude from Ateneo de Manila University with a degree in communication, and also previously worked as a writer-producer for a late-night newscast on GMA7. She has covered the environment, agriculture, and disaster beat, giving her the chance to cover the 2015 Paris Climate Change Conference, chase super typhoons, and report their impact on communities. She started covering Philippine politics during the 2016 national elections when she tailed the presidential campaign of then Mayor Rodrigo Duterte. Currently, she covers the office of the president and the Bangsamoro regional issues for Rappler. Ladies and gentlemen, let us all welcome Ms. Pia Ranada.
Hello everyone, good morning. Again, I'm Pia Ranada, Rappler's multimedia reporter covering Malacanang. And I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of the Ateneo School of Government to the second leg of Halalan 2.0, holding free, fair, and safe elections in the new normal. So for everyone's information, this is the second forum in a series of webinars that will tackle how countries have managed to conduct their elections amid the COVID-19 pandemic. And for countries like the Philippines, of course, we all know we're gearing up for our own elections in 2022. It will be really important and interesting to know the best practices and lessons learned and challenges that these countries have faced so we can also better prepare for our own elections. So this Halalan webinar also aims to gather insights from election experts, and the end goal of this whole event is to compile these best practices into a manual that will recommend measures and policies to ensure the conduct of safe elections next year. So to formally begin our webinar, may we call on the Director of CIFAL Philippines, Dr. Edna Ko, to give us her opening remarks. Let's all give her a virtual round of applause.
Thank you very much, Pia, for the wonderful welcome and introduction. I would like to first of all greet everyone a good morning or good evening wherever you are in the world, and of course a special welcome and thanks in advance for gracing this occasion and this activity put together by the Ateneo School of Government and Project Participate. We actually welcome our three guests, our speakers and resource persons, experts in on elections. But first of all, let me go down a little bit of history, Philippine history. The United
Okay, so it seems we are encountering a bit of a technical difficulty. Dr. Edna Ko was disconnected, so we will just hopefully we can return to her later. Maybe she can give her remarks later when we've established her connection. So, but for now, maybe we can go and proceed with our program, and we'll begin with giving you a few reminders for today. So, obviously, we are all at home. We're all watching this from wherever we are, connected to the internet, and we have had to change the usual forum procedure when it comes to the flow and the Q&A portion. So just to give you a rundown of what will happen today, our resource speaker will be given 20 minutes to deliver his presentation, and then the organizers, and then after the resource speaker, we will have a short discussion with our invited reactors to be followed by an open forum with the participants. So earlier you raised that you might have heard that you had the option to raise your hand and verbally ask questions, but this was modified by the organizers to better direct the flow of the conversation. So we will only be accepting sent in questions or questions sent by message through the Q&A box. So you can find the Q&A box at the bottom of your monitor, and please make your questions brief and straight to the point and address it to whoever you'd like to answer that question. So due to time considerations, the organizer may only select a certain number of questions from the audience. We also encourage our audience watching on the live stream to leave their comments so that we can return to them. And everyone who is watching, we are encouraging you to post or tweet about this webinar using the hashtags hashtag Let's Vote In and hashtag COVID Free Halalan webinar series. So without further ado, I don't think we have. Okay, sorry. Doc Edna is now online. So Dr. Edna Ko, we would really love to hear your opening remarks. Are you here?
Yes, I am, Pia. Thank you
All
very
right.
much
Okay, go ahead, ma'am.
for your emergency measure. Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to greet everyone good morning and welcome, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. And thank you and welcome to our resource persons and experts for today. On behalf of the Ateneo School of Government and Project Participate, we look forward to a very vibrant discussion and sharing of the US experience of the elections under a pandemic, the COVID-19 crisis. As you know, to begin with, I'd like to go back a little bit to history by saying that the United States of America and the Philippines have a tradition, have a history of relationship, both in the political and in the administrative spheres. Very much alive in the context of the influence of the American tradition and politics and administration are stuff like introduction of the concept of democracy. Of course, we used to have a traditional democracy prior to the American influence, but it is in the concept of democracy in which elections, the two-party system, the building of political parties are very strongly introduced, or were very strongly introduced in our history and in the tradition of modern Philippine politics. It is also in this regard that we have had the embracing of the so-called the tripartite branches of government, the three branches of government separated, independent from each other, but hopefully collaborating with each other and complementing each other. A history, a very good influence of education and educational system. As I said, in the politics and administration, it was the so-called spoils system in the language of public administration, meaning the introduction of patronage, of bringing in favored people into the political system that really brought forth and introduced the concept of creating neutrality in the service, and of course, professionalism, and therefore the creation of the Civil Service Commission. We followed very much the political and administrative tracks of the US, and we copied it with some deviation and with some specific characteristics. For one, political parties, unlike in the US, which is a two-party system, has been a party system, which creates some headaches for our Commission on Elections and for our voters. Having said this, however, let me go back to a second point, which is that starting off as an academic and a university official in the United States, and later on becoming a president of the US, Woodrow Wilson has brought to us the so-called Wilsonian Theory, which is a dichotomy between politics and administration. In such Wilsonian theory, so to speak, Wilson at that time or during his time advocated for the freedom of administration from the hurry and strife of politics. That politics should not intervene in the managerial and administrative way of running the affairs of public service and public affairs in general. However, over the years, the so-called politics administration dichotomy suffered a challenge, has encountered a challenge. It has been put to a test by raising a question: can there really be a separation between politics and administration? And the discourse continues until today among scholars and among scholars who take stock of the experiences, the real world in politics. The advocacy of Wilson at the time was put administration and management as a science, and truly a science that upholds public service and public value, that it is neutral outside of politics. However, we have an intervening variable at this point in time in the country and in the world. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought to us a new challenge in the way and in the manner we run things, including probably the way we run our elections, our political party system, and probably the way we will deal with citizens to encourage them to participate in what is, for some, a dreadful exercise of registration and voting. Therefore, COVID-19 crisis has become a tricky challenge to all of us in the electoral system. It has become a challenge for the Commission on Election to overcome. It has become a challenge for the system and for the administration to truly apply science rather than politics. It has become really a continuing question whether COVID-19 could become a threat to make it as a political tool of exercising power over the right of people to exercise the right to vote. And therefore, at this point, we are going to hear, and I'd like to welcome our experts from the United States, the experience of the US, and once again listen to another country experience in how they dealt with the pandemic under a period of a pandemia, the success of an election, how people have retained their human right to vote, to make a decision in the democratic way. And by sharing with us the US experience, we hope that we could learn from it and that our own electoral system could truly find value to uphold democracy as a continuing exercise of freedom by our citizens. And so with no more further ado, I'd like to once again welcome everyone to this discussion, to this interesting conversation. And thank you very much, and welcome to a Filipino conversation on COVID-19 and the electoral experience of the United States. Thank you very much, gentlemen, and thank you, everyone. Good morning.
Thank you, Doc Edna, for setting the tone for this day's webinar, and it's a very good way to start, no, like reminding us all how similar the democratic institutions of the U.S. are in the Philippines, the history we share, but also outlining, right, what's at stake in the May 2022 elections, and how this could be used to maybe even step on rights or get in the way of people exercising their right to vote. So without further ado, I will now move on to introducing our guest speaker, and I'm personally very excited to hear from him because I'd love to learn about the experience of the United States, especially as reporters will also be covering the elections, and we're excited to know how this COVID pandemic will affect our jobs. So let me introduce. Our first speaker was nominated by President Barack Obama and confirmed by unanimous consent by the United States Senate on December 16, 2014, to serve on the United States Election Assistance Commission, or EAC. He has served twice as chairman of the commission and will assume the position of vice chair later this month. He serves as a designated federal officer for the Board of Advisors. He has focused his efforts on voter access. Under his leadership, the EAC developed a pocket-sized voter card in both Braille and large print that serves as a guide for voters with disabilities. From 2003 to 2014, he served as a senior elections counsel and minority elections counsel in the United States House of Representatives Committee on House Administration. From 2001 to 2003, he was a senior lobbyist and policy analyst for Common Cause. From 1993 to 2001, he served in the Clinton administration in the Office of Congressional Relations for the Office of Personnel Management. He received his JD from the Catholic University of America, Columbus School of Law, and his BA in Government from Clark University. He also studied at the University of London and the University of Adelaide. Ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome our research speaker, Commissioner Thomas Hicks. And
Thank
joining
you.
Commissioner
Thank you,
Hicks.
Peter.
Hi, sir.
Go on.
Yep, I'll just mention that joining you today are two guest reactors. Our first reactor is Professor of Political Science, Director of the Elections Research Center, and the Lyons Family Chair in Electoral Politics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research and teaching focus on U.S. elections, public opinion, representation in the U.S. Congress. His recent research has centered on aspects of election administration and voter participation. He is the author of Personal Roots of Representation, co-editor of The Measure of American Elections, co-author of Why Americans Split Their Tickets, and editor of Uncertainty in American Politics. He has published articles in journals such as the American Political Science Review, American Journal of Political Science, British Journal of Political Science, Public Opinion Quarterly, Legislative Studies Quarterly, and Election Law Journal. He has also served as an expert witness in multiple federal and state election-related lawsuits in the U.S. Ladies and gentlemen, let's also welcome Dr. Barry Burden. And our final reactor is the Edgar Thomas Cato Distinguished Associate Professor in the Hussman School of Journalism and Media and the Principal Researcher for the Center for Information Technology and Public Life at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He is the co-author of Power in Ideas, a case-based argument for taking ideas seriously in political communication research, first author of Recoding the Boys Club, The Experiences and Future of Women in Political Technology, and author of Prototype Politics, Technology-Intensive Campaigning, and the Data of Democracy and Taking Our Country Back, The Crafting of Network Politics from Howard Dean to Barack Obama. He is an affiliated fellow of the Information Society Project at Yale Law School and received a PhD in communication from Stanford University. Please welcome Dr. Daniel Kreiss. So now that we welcomed our speaker lineup today, that was quite a mouthful. Let us now proceed to the presentation of our research speaker, Commissioner Hicks, to be followed by a discussion with our guest reactors, Dr. Burden and Dr. Kreiss. So again, welcome, Commissioner Thomas Hicks.
Thank you. I will share my screen and proceed. Again, thank you, Peter, and I want to thank Dr. Edna for her opening remarks. I'm Thomas Hicks, a commissioner with the United States Election Assistance Commission. I want to thank you and the administration, faculty, and staff of the University School of Government for inviting me here to speak today about conducting an election during a pandemic. As you know, the United States held our general election on November 3rd, which included elections for the federal office of Congress and for president. I hope that sharing our recent experience helps the Philippines with their national elections in May of 2022. Before I begin, I would like to give a little background on our agency and who we are and what we do. The EAC is a bipartisan federal agency created by the Help America Vote Act of 2002 to help election officials improve the administration of elections, and help Americans participate in the process. We work closely with state and local election officials to make sure that everything is in order for voters to cast a meaningful ballot on election day. And how do we do this? We distribute funds to the states, and just last year, the U.S. Congress allocated $400 million to our agency to emergency funding to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm proud to say that our agency got that money out within 30 days. 400 million may sound like a lot, but if you divide that by 50 states and our 6 territories in DC, it doesn't come up to be too much. So I'm going to show a slide later on how that actually broke down. The agency also establishes standards for voting technology used in elections. Just last week, we issued a new set of guidelines for voting systems, which are our second iteration of those guidelines. We also serve as a clearinghouse for best practices for states and local administrators. And finally, we administer the National Voter Registration Form. And I will show a short video on summarizing that.
So what is the EAC? Glad you asked. EAC stands for Election Assistance Commission. And simply put, our goal is to make your job easier. Now, seriously, we were established by the Help America Vote Act of 2002 as an independent, bipartisan commission charged with helping Americans vote. The primary way we do that? By ensuring election officials have the support and resources they need. We help in a few ways. We craft and adopt the voluntary voting system guidelines, accredit test laboratories, and certify voting systems, serve as the nation's clearinghouse of information and best practices related to elections. We also maintain the National Mail Voter Registration Form, which can be used to register to vote, update registration information with a new name or address, or register with a political party, and develop recommendations and standards that address the needs of voters, state and local election leaders, and other election stakeholders. At the end of the day, we work to ensure every eligible American has the opportunity to vote independently, privately, and with confidence in our nation's election system. We do everything in our power to make sure election officials have what they need to support that. Learn more at eac.gov.
That video means a lot to me because I've traveled to all 50 states and a number of countries around the world, and my parents still ask me, what do I exactly do for work? And so that video summarizes a lot of what the EAC does. Before I talk about the recent experience with our elections, I'm going to give a short lesson on the history of the electoral process in the United States. States and local jurisdictions run the elections. So there are more than 50 election administrators across the country. It's non-uniform. So our Constitution grants the states legislatures the ability to determine time, place, and manner on how that. So except for the long-standing statutory requirement to hold federal elections then Tuesday next after the first Monday in November, the 50 states and 6 territories basically administer their own elections. So what does that mean? There's over 8,000 jurisdictions in the United States running those elections, which works in terms of decentralization, which makes it harder to actually hack into any one system or any one location and disrupt the election overall. But this map just basically showing the East Coast over lays out a lot of those jurisdictions. So this wheel basically shows that the election administrators do a lot more than just administer the elections overall. So some of the things that I've learned in my travels is that not only do the state administrators or the local administrators have to deal with canvassing and vote tabulation, military and overseas voters, public relations, and so forth. They also handle things like issuing marriage licenses or doing the branding on cattle down in Texas and so forth. Even had some administrators who are school bus drivers as well. So these folks are doing a lot more than just administrating elections on election night. And they're also doing things like cybersecurity, dealing with e-poll books, electronic poll books, and other non-voting technology. Just things have changed since the 2000 election for us. So I can't say that the EAC is the only federal entity that deals with elections overall, but we are the only one that deals with the administration of elections. We're commonly confused with the Federal Elections Commission, which deals with the campaign behavior of candidates and also with campaign finance. So, but we've also started working with other agencies like the Department of Homeland Security, Cyber Infrastructure and Security Agency, the Federal Voting Assistance Program that handles voting for overseas and military voters, the Department of Justice, the Census Bureau, and the Department of the U.S. Postal Service. If you had told me last year or 2 years ago that we would be working with the Centers for Disease Control for elections, I would be very terrified. But we did work with them this year, and I think some of the work that they helped us with helped in terms of ensuring that polling places remain safe and people remain socially distant. So what exactly did we do? Through our chairman at the time, Ben Hovland, he established the Government Coordinating Council Joint COVID Working Group.
So I got disconnected from my phone, so hopefully you can still hear me. So Peter, if you can tell me if you can still hear me.
Yep, loud and clear.
Okay, all right, great. So we worked with the Joint COVID Working Group to develop information for the administration of elections and secure infrastructure and so forth.
Oh, Commissioner Hicks, I think you're on mute.
Oh, somehow it just keeps jumping back and forth. Okay. So the working group developed vote by mail and absentee timelines in terms of what sort of things need to be done so that vote by mail could be counted, helping voters request a ballot, increasing the outbound ballots that were going in, providing for ballot processing, meaning that paying for high-speed scanners and so forth. Another big issue this year was ballot drop boxes, where they could be located, the construction of them. Should they be as strong as mailboxes? Or should they be even stronger than? And then a huge issue with the signature verification and curing process. But it was amazing to run the elections this year for the locals, because not only did they have to deal with vote by mail, they had to deal with voting in person. So they were basically running two simultaneous elections and trying to do that in a way to ensure accuracy and to ensure that confidence remained high with voters. So we also held a number of public hearings as the primary season ended. Basically hearing from state and locals, the disability folks. We heard from manufacturers, gave us guidance on cleaning the machines to ensure that people weren't using harsh chemicals when they were going to vote, or wiping them down that could basically destroy the machines or deal with the counting process overall. We also had a video series. So there are 5 states in the United States that actually do voting completely by mail. It's mostly our Western states, but since it was increasing across the country, we had folks come in to talk about how they dealt with this, because it was basically a 20-year journey for them to implement this. And so when they did that, many folks got an understanding of how to actually conduct vote by mail through our video series. A little earlier, I talked about the funding that we gave out, the $400 million, and it was based on a formula under the Help America Vote Act, which basically says that the larger states in terms of population will receive more money. So California, which is on the West Coast, Texas in the South, and Florida in the East are darker on this chart because they received more money. But states like Montana and North Dakota in the north there are lighter, but they got the minimum amount of $3 million to administer the CARES Act funding. The bad part of the funding was that it had to be used before December 31st, 2020, or it reverted back to the US Treasury. So what were some of the things that were paid for? So increase in postage, printing, and equipment overall, but also personal protective equipment and moving polling locations. Because in the United States, some voting locations are even located in nursing homes and in schools and so forth. So in order to protect those residents and those students who are actually doing in-person learning, those locations were moved. So here is my contact information. If anyone should have questions after this is done, but overall, I think that the election ran pretty smoothly. My biggest complaint still is the fact that I've worked on Capitol Hill for over 10 years, and to see the insurrection on January 6th, when the counting of the Electoral College occurred, was very disheartening to me for two reasons. One, because of the country that I love, seeing that happen here. But two, because the committee that I worked for was actually the committee that counts those ballots. So I would have been on the floor that day. And so to think about an insurrection and people storming the Capitol just to try to make it so that their violent voice could be heard was unfathomable to me. But again, I want to hear the reactions from the two professors, and hopefully we'll have a vibrant discussion. And if I've missed anything, I'll be happy to share some more later.
All right. Thank you so much, Commissioner Hicks, for that presentation. I think very interesting, like the technical aspects. I have a lot of questions for you myself. But for now, we'll proceed to the reactors of our guest reactors. And now we'll start with Dr. Burden. So Dr. Burden, if you could give us a 10-minute or roundabout 10-minute reaction to what Commissioner Hicks said.
Yes, thank you, Pia. Thank you, Commissioner Hicks, and thanks to everyone for organizing this. It's sort of a wonderful coincidence that I'm speaking here today because it's actually election day in my state of Wisconsin. Just a few hours ago, I went to my neighborhood polling place and cast a ballot with my mask on, using a sterilized pen behind a plexiglass barrier where I communicated with the poll workers and then fed my ballot into the machine. Just to sort of reinforce what Commissioner Hicks said, the 2020 election was probably the most radical change in how Americans vote in the history of the country. Most of the time, states evolve their voting practices over many years as candidates and voters adapt to the system. But this was something that happened in the course of essentially 6 months from the time the pandemic hit in the spring until the November election. And there were many problems along the way, particularly in the spring and summer primary elections. But I think there were a lot of successes too, and that's what the Philippines can learn from. So let me just highlight that voter participation in the 2020 elections was the highest in a century, really remarkable, and only made possible because of the heroic efforts really of state and local election officials. And the most surprising to me was that the huge number of ballots that were submitted by mail were accepted for counting at very high rates. in previous elections, somewhere between 1% to 2% of ballots that were submitted by mail would be rejected because those ballots arrived too late, or they were missing a signature, or there was some other defect with the ballot that caused election officials to set the ballot aside. And that's a very problematic experience because the voter is not there to take action and correct the ballot as they would be at the polling place. So my greatest fear heading into the 2020 election is that millions of ballots would be rejected, as so many people were voting by mail for the first time and would be apt to make mistakes, or our postal service would fail to meet their delivery standards. That mostly didn't happen. From the data we have so far, it looks as though ballot acceptance was higher maybe than ever in American history as far back as we have data. So lots of successes this year. What happened to make a success? One factor, I think, is that states began working with the Postal Service in a way they had not before. As Commissioner Hicks mentioned, states in the western part of the United States, like Washington and Oregon, have been voting by mail for many years. And so they developed good working relationships between their election officials and the Postal Service. But that was not the case in many parts of the country. And in some places, there was actually hostility or resistance to collaborating. And that led to real problems. But those, I think, got ironed out as the November election approached. In my state of Wisconsin, I know that election officials and the Postal Service had weekly meetings to talk about delivery problems, to talk about how to identify election mail and separate it from other mail to make sure that it was delivered by Election Day, which was the deadline for receipt of ballots. That was essential. Other mail can be delayed by a day, and it's not especially problematic, but a ballot that misses the deadline won't be counted, and it has disenfranchised that voter. So I think those working relationships are important to establish early. The $400 million that Commissioner Hicks mentioned was spent pretty heavily on protective equipment for poll workers and for voters. And I think it's important to think about both sides. Recruiting poll workers became a huge challenge over the spring and summer in the United States because many of the people who work at the polls are elderly and are more vulnerable to COVID. And so many of them resisted serving again, even though they loved the job and had done it for many years. And that forced election officials to go find new people to serve in those roles. That was a challenge during COVID, but I'll just mention some ways that I think election officials had success doing that. One is that they offered higher salaries. In many states, poll workers are paid for their time that they commit during Election Day. And states, in many cases, increased the salaries they could offer because of the federal funds that were offered or because of private funding that they got from foundations. That was true in my state, where the salary for poll workers was doubled in the 2020 election. And that made it easier to recruit people, especially people who were facing economic challenges during the pandemic. And there was a real effort to recruit, in particular, younger people to serve as poll workers who are not well represented in the ranks of poll workers, and I think we're happy to step in, and it was a good experience for them as well. But there were also other creative efforts to try to find poll workers, including people who had worked in the restaurant industry or in bars and taverns that were now out of work because of COVID. In some cases, members of the National Guard, which is our voluntary civilian branch of the military in the United States, they were marshaled to serve in a civilian role at the polls, and that also was a good experience and helped augment where there were some shortages. Commissioner Hicks mentioned drop boxes as well. The states in the western part of the United States who have been voting by mail for decades have learned that in their states before COVID, every voter receives a ballot by mail, but most voters actually prefer to return the ballot in person, either because of a distrust of the mail system or because of a concern that they're going to miss the deadline. Most voters would prefer to drive that ballot in or to leave it in a drop box, these publicly stationed boxes that look like US mailboxes. Other states had very little experience with drop boxes. They had not planned for sites. They hadn't done the research to figure out where they belong. They certainly hadn't thought about materials or suppliers. And I think having some planning there and federal funds and some private funds really went a long way in terms of identifying the right equipment and putting it in the right places to be effective. Another thing that I think election officials did well in 2020 was in providing information and transparency. It was a campaign, particularly the presidential campaign, that was full of misinformation and disinformation. Much of it on social media, some of it by word of mouth and other media outlets. And so I think the special role that election officials play is that they are authoritative sources of information. And they can get the attention of journalists to ensure that their voices are heard. And they end up repeating the same information over and over to different audiences throughout the campaign. I'm sure it's draining on them, but it's essential to continue to flood the airwaves with correct information to combat the misunderstandings or misinformation that's out there. That's harder to do during COVID, but I can say that election officials came through. They innovated in a number of ways. They did many more press releases. They did live streams. They did Facebook events. They did media availabilities online. They issued fact guides for voters to sort of set the record straight about elections, and generally made themselves available to demystify the process and dispel misinformation. That's probably the most essential thing that someone at the top of the election infrastructure in a state or locality can do, is to simply provide correct information. And I think that information went a long way to that first issue I mentioned of ballots that were rejected. The rejection rate for mail ballots was extremely low in 2020. And I think that's partly a tribute to election officials who encouraged voters to request absentee ballots early, to make sure they were registered early, to ensure that they had identification or whatever else was needed, and to return those ballots early in the event that the Postal Service or some other problem got in the way and prevented the on-time delivery of those ballots. So I think the repeated messaging around the timeliness and the need to act early, and some actually bad experiences that voters had in the spring and summer, helped make sure that was possible. I'll just raise a couple of warnings of things that concerned me a little bit in the 2020 US election that I think Philippine officials may want to take into account. One warning is not to prematurely close down traditional neighborhood polling places. In the United States, at least, this has been the way that most voters cast ballots. They travel the way I did today to a polling place that might be within a mile or a few miles of their home. It's a familiar setting. It's often a school or a church or a community center or a government building. And people rely on those and are familiar with those places. And they're essential, actually, for voters who lack transportation or who have disabilities and need assistance at the polls. So there were some really interesting experiments in 2020 with voting in sports arenas, big basketball, football, baseball stadiums, and other places. And I think that was attractive for a lot of voters, and it provided a lot of room for spacing, for social distancing. But it's not a solution for voters who don't have the time to travel to one of those distant arenas, or who lack transportation, or simply need the accessible machinery and the help of local poll workers. So I think, as Commissioner Hicks said, election officials during COVID are essentially running multiple elections simultaneously. A mail election in addition to the traditional neighborhood polling place election. I think that's really important. The other warning I'll just mention more quickly is that during COVID, the political campaigns are restricted in the kinds of things they can do. They were not doing in the United States as many in-person events, campaign rallies. They weren't going from door to door, giving people literature and trying to persuade voters. And that meant that voters weren't getting information about how to vote that they would normally get from a political party or a candidate. And so that actually puts more pressure on election officials to make sure that the public is informed and prepared. So that's back on my earlier emphasis on just providing in a repetitive way to lots of different audiences and through lots of different means, good, authoritative, trustworthy information to combat the lack of information or the misinformation that can sometimes be spread. So those are just a few thoughts on how things went in the US in 2020.
Thank you, Dr. Burden, for that insight. And many more questions actually arose from your insights as well. I mean, very interesting when you talked about how poll workers had to you wanted the government wanted to hire younger poll workers and even bar workers. So that's something that maybe we could see in the Philippines. So now we're going to move on to our next reactor. Dr. Kreiss, could we have your reaction to Commissioner Hicks' presentation?
Yeah, thank you so much. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank Commissioner Hicks for all of his service to this country over the years, and particularly at a very trying time during this election cycle. And the fact that this was such a secure election, and as Professor Burden pointed out, we had historic voting participation rates, really suggest that our electoral system is robust, and thanks to the work of Commissioner Hicks and many others. Professor Burden left me with a perfect segue in terms of talking about the role of campaigns and also the role of digital and social media companies in this election, in terms of what they did to provide a COVID-safe electoral campaign seasons. Because you don't get historic voting participation patterns without campaigns mobilizing voters. And one of the things that is unique in 2021 is that campaigns now have a full suite of digital technologies and digital tools in order to mobilize and communicate with voters virtually, that they simply didn't have 10, 15, 20 years ago. And in general, these things can include everything from Facebook and YouTube ads, search ads on Google, interactive websites. We saw the massive expansion of text messaging campaigns this particular cycle. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about my only area of expertise, which is digital campaigning. Because a lot of, I think, the innovations that we saw in 2020 related to how campaigns adapted to this new environment. So how did they supplement for the fact that they lost a lot of those large rallies and they lost a lot of those door-to-door campaigns? And more importantly, I think looking ahead to the Philippines experience coming up is what can they do differently and better to improve on what happened in 2020. So I want to start, first of all, just by saying a little bit more about what we saw on the campaign side in order to attempt to ensure the conduct of safe and healthy elections. And here I would be remiss in not talking out that we did see significant partisan differences, especially at the top of the presidential ticket with respect to the differences between the way the Trump campaign did in fact continue to conduct large-scale rallies, including violating local health ordinances in a number of states, including my own in North Carolina. You also saw Republicans being much more willing to engage in canvassing operations, although that varied very much within the states itself. But it does seem like the Trump team tried to stand up really a traditional campaign in many ways, and certainly sort of issued guidelines around things like masking and the like, but kind of inconsistently enforced. And that accords broadly with, I think, some of the partisan differences we saw in the United States that has meant why COVID has been such a challenging, not only a health crisis, but also one that had a set of politics mapped onto it. I think what we saw a little bit more on the Democratic side of the aisle, and specifically the Biden campaign, was really creating a full-scale digital campaign operation to the extent that we simply haven't seen before. This meant moving all events to be virtual. They worked very hard to make candidate availability to be held on things like virtual platforms. They actively reached out to and engaged with various civil society groups to mobilize their membership to tune into things like virtual panels, policy briefings, virtual campaign rallies, and the like. They engaged in this both on a national level, but also on a really in-depth state level, where they were reaching out through surrogates and putting together various forms of events. Again, on the idea that most people are conducting work and schooling, et cetera, online, so that it would be a natural extension people's days, and that they can create those sorts of touch points for people. We saw the expansion of canvassing. This was a cycle where digital canvassing, especially through text messages, really boomed, particularly on the Democratic side of the aisle, but both Democrats and Republicans. Again, this was a very personalized way that instead of knocking on someone's door, you could actually get your message out in front of voters. You can do things like engage in voter registration drives. You can do things like engage in, depending on the state, absentee ballot requests. You can make volunteers available to help people walk through the process, to check in with them, et cetera. That exploded this year, as well as just the standard suite that we've seen for really a long time in the United States over the last decade, the expansion of things like digital advertising on Facebook, and the movement of things like push for voter registration, the push for absentee ballots, the push for early vote in states that allow early voting. Massive pushes and massive amounts of money put behind digital advertising to engage with voters, and these things are highly targeted, so that campaigns, all political parties and campaigns work off of various voter lists. So they were really sort of moving a lot of the operations that used to be done in person online. I think a couple of things briefly. I think sort of going forward in the Philippines is that there should be more coordination between the parties. So there is an ethics of campaigning, I think, during COVID. And it would make sense that either political, civil society organizations or some of the arms of party organizations themselves can work together to set up guidelines about how campaigning should be conducted. In essence, if we want to think about sort of, we should have fair elections conducted on an open playing field, it seems to me that practitioners and professionals themselves could come to a set of agreements. It also seems to me like state health officials should be involved in issuing things like general guidelines for campaign-specific activities. This was also very uneven in the states. You saw general guidelines about things like gatherings and the like. But issuing guidelines specifically relating to campaigns and then having and asking practitioners to adhere and sign on to them, I think is important. The other thing that we saw this cycle, and this is the second major area I'll point to, is that Facebook and Google and Twitter in particular were much better prepared for the 2020 elections than the 2016 elections. And what we saw across the board were that these companies had much greater collaboration with civil society as well as state bodies, including things like the National Association of State Election Directors, the National Association of Secretaries of State. There were both more formal and informal channels of collaboration. So when Facebook would set up its voter resource center, they wanted to make sure that they were putting out good information in front of voters. All these companies sort of really expanded the, again, going back to what Barry discussed earlier, they took a lot of the information that was already being produced by local election agencies and officials, and they looked to amplify those. They looked to gather them together. They created much more opt-in opportunities so that voters could go to clearinghouses, say on Facebook and on Google, and find reliable information about their polling district, about processes, and the like. We saw sweeping changes from 2016 around things like the verification and transparency of political ads. We saw much more stepped up efforts from all the major platform companies around things like election disinformation. And that was done through deep collaboration with academic researchers, with the FBI and other agencies, as well as local elections administrators and the like. However, we do see a couple of issues heading into, or we did see a number of issues in 2020 in the US that, again, I would say Philippines agencies and executive bodies should be thinking of. We still saw very evolving policies over the course of the election around things like election disinformation and misinformation. And we saw not only continually evolving policies, but very inconsistent enforcement. Obviously, there's a lot of political pressure on platforms to make certain decisions. But one thing that was deeply problematic is that there were a number of instances where election misinformation would be out there about things like the processes and procedures of voting, including what was posted by elected officials. And Facebook and other companies were very slow to react to that. You saw particularly early on in the election, Facebook and Google in particular be criticized by a number of local state election administrators for leaving up things like inconsistent wording on certain ballot measures, on the failure to take down election disinformation or voter suppression attempts. Again, I think with better and increased collaboration, some of these things could very much be improved. We did see more collaboration than before with things like local election officials, but there could absolutely be much more. And I think all of these companies should be called to account in the Philippines, but also countries around the world, to have much clearer policies and much more consistent enforcement around things like election disinformation, around things like, issuing guidelines about what gets taken up and what gets taken down. I think they could all create much better ways of pushing out good information, not simply relying on voters to opt into good information. And again, all this really matters because with COVID, much more campaigning is online and much more political communication information is consumed online. So those are the things that I would sort of point to as sort of lessons learned and looking ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kreiss. A lot to mull on from all of our speakers and our reactors. I mean, just making me think of the major differences between the US and the Philippines, like the fact that in the Philippines, many remote areas have no internet access or very slow internet. So I'm not sure how it's going to work where most campaigns will be transferring online. And also in the Philippines, there is not as much trust in the Postal Service, sad to say. I mean, our experience here is quite limited. You mentioned that in the States, it's used for remote areas and for the military outposts. But in the Philippines, I think it's mostly OFWs in embassies abroad that use the PhilPost service for their mail-in voting. So those, I think, are issues that will definitely come up in the future, like as we prepare for the elections in our country. So to start with, I'd like to take this opportunity, being a moderator, like a privilege, to maybe send a field in one question. Here in the Philippines, a lot of politicians thumb down mail-in voting. And for instance, our Senate President Tito Soto says that mail-in voting increases the chances of cheating. So I know this is something that's been floated by the Trump campaign many times during your elections, but I just want to ask Commissioner Hicks, what can you explain, for example, the chances of cheating in mail-in voting versus physical voting, and how the US government, what steps they took to ensure that cheating would not happen in mail-in voting of this magnitude?
That's a great question. One, the way that it's done is that, it depends on the state. So for the states, as the professors were saying, out west that do all mail-in balloting, those states automatically mail the registered voters a ballot to be filled out after each election cycle. We saw this time around for states that were doing requesting of ballots, if I request 10 ballots and I send all 10 in, only one will count. It's the same thing if I send in my tax returns 10 times, I'm not going to get 10 checks. They're going to verify it, and then anyone after that, you're not going to receive. That ballot's not going to count. So only one ballot per voter is allowed, and it's the same as if I go into a polling place. So if I go into a polling place and I show the resident IDs and so forth, I get one ballot, I vote, and my name is checked off. So if I do that via the mail, my name is checked off as receiving my ballot and ballot coming back.
Can I add something to that, Pia?
Sure, yes, please.
Yeah, it's a great question. I should have mentioned in my comments, this was one of the things that states did that was new in a lot of parts of the country, was providing tools to allow voters and election officials to track mail ballots as they went back and forth. So in most parts of the United States, a voter has to request a ballot by mail. That request then gets issued and the ballot is mailed to them. The voter would receive it at their home, complete the ballot, and then either return it in person or return it by mail. So there are a lot of steps in that process where something could go wrong. and where you might think there could be fraud or cheating or ballots being stolen or some other problem. But those kinds of problems are quite rare. And the tracking tools provide a kind of confidence and transparency for both the voter to be sure that nothing has happened to their ballot and it's going to be returned on time. And for the election official, if there's any worry about some malfeasance, they can turn to those tools and check them. So there were some states like Colorado, which had a really nice ballot tracking system in place for years before 2020, but other states hopped on board very quickly last year, including Wisconsin, where I live, to provide more of those tools. And I think that's something that will be coming in the future. It's not a reform that has an obvious partisan advantage to one side or the other. It's a technical improvement to the system that I think will make everybody happier.
Yeah, so I guess a robust tracking and verification process is really necessary. And I guess, like non-government offices or civil societies being more vigilant about reports of like people trying to get ballots from this voter before it makes it to the drop box. So I guess, yeah, those things could probably be something to watch out for when we prepare for our elections. So now we're going to move on to the questions sent in from the audience, and we're going to start with a question on election resources and management. And this is from the ASOG Dean himself, Rod Mendoza. So he says, thank you for your presentation. And his question is, what additional budget became necessary to help COVID-proof the 2022 US elections? How much was paid by federal and how much was paid by the local government? In your opinion, what percentage increase under a normal election did COVID-proofing imply?
Well, unfortunately, elections are usually looked at as the last thing to be funded. Fire stations, schools, roads, those things are all funded before elections are. So over the last 3 years, a little over $1 billion has come to the states overall to improve the electoral process. In 2020, $400 million was given by the U.S. Congress, distributed by our agency to the states for increasing federal funds for the pandemic and improving the process overall for the administration of elections. I don't know the percentage of local governments and what they've paid into the process, but until 2002, with the Help America Vote Act, the locals had funded the federal elections 100% of the time, and only for the first time with the Help America Vote Act, which gave a little over $3 billion to the states to get rid of punch card machines and improve the process overall because of the things we saw with the Bush v. Gore campaign. So I can't answer to what local governments have been given, but what the federal government gave was $400 million to improve the process in 2020.
We have another question on, this one is about alternative forms of voting from Eugene Cao. And his question is, it seems one critical component that made the US election successful was the mail voting system. So did US have to pass a law to allow mail voting? And 3, how is the US reinforcing its postal system to make it useful specifically for elections?
So there was no law passed. There's always been an aspect of mail-in voting for each state. So for instance, people would not be home during the election time so they could request an absentee ballot. That's always been around since the Civil War. The aspect of it for 2020 is it was scaled up immensely. So there's no new laws that were done. There were some laws changed, which caused some controversy in terms of just election year changes in terms of when those ballots, if they had to have postmarks, when they could be received. Some states say that they have to be received on election night. Some say that you have to have it postmarked by election day. And California gives up to 17 days after it's postmarked on election day to be received. And that's because of the slowness of sometimes of the mail service. So what was the second part of the question?
He asked, how is the US reinforcing its postal system to make it useful specifically for elections?
So the Postal Service has been running a significant debt for the last 20 plus years. But in our interactions with the Postal Service, for the most part, they've put priority to mail-in balloting, where they've increased the number of people working around election time, or even having the tracking service being a part of it now. But that still costs the states money overall, and encouraging the states to try to use first-class mail as opposed to bulk mail, which runs slower. So I think the Postal Service, if it's not politicized, can do a little bit of a better job in terms of working with their local jurisdictions to ensure that the mail is received timely.
And the Postal Service also has some tools it's given election officials to mark election mail as being separate from other mail. So there's a special election mail logo that can be put on mail envelopes. And so when postal workers see those, they know to pull them out and put them into a separate stream. I think there are even tags and bags for handling election mail that can segregate those from other kinds of mail. And that was a way for, I think, the Postal Service to prioritize that mail as it got close to election day.
We have a question here on media and disinformation and digital campaigning. How can the Philippines government agencies and civil society organizations both counter mis or disinformation regarding elections? What safeguards should be placed if mis or disinformation comes from government officials or entities?
Well, that's a $1 million question. Oh, sorry.
No, go on, because you're the expert on that. I was going to say, over my shoulder over my shoulder is a poster from the National Association of Secretary of State. And when we had our last in-person conference back in February of 2020, I had about 30 of the secretaries sign that. And what that campaign was about was trusted info. So to go to trusted sources to get the information that you are looking for the election overall. I've had my own family members come up to me and say that they saw something on Facebook or on Twitter, and is this true? And I say, well, you have to go to trusted sources. And so know where you're getting that information from. So if someone is coming up and saying that the polling place is being moved, what sort of authority do they have to know that that's been moved, and why would you follow them? It's the same thing that I say all the time of disinformation has been around since elections have been around, where the Republicans were told to vote on Wednesday and Democrats were told to vote on Thursday. It's just now that it's instantaneous, and because it's read on the computer, people feel that it's the same as if they see it in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, and that it's been verified, and that's not necessarily the case. So I would say to definitely go to trusted sources to get your information, and look for folks who have that blue check mark. For instance, we worked really closely with Twitter and NAS and NASED to get election officials check marks to be trusted sources. So if folks sign up to follow me on Twitter, they'll see that I have that blue check mark.
Yeah, I agree with everything the commissioner said. I think just to amplify a few things. So looking ahead, it's important to have that clearinghouse of reliable information. It's important to develop both formal and informal channels of communication with platform companies themselves. And, I think that also means adapting to whatever the information environment looks like in the Philippines. So for instance, if SMS, WhatsApp technology is something that's far more useful on mobile devices in rural parts of the area, then it is about sort of working with Facebook's WhatsApp team in order to make sure that good information is going out there. I would also say, a point I think really worth making is that the challenge here is that oftentimes good information falls flat when it just requires people to opt into good information, right? That's sort of, you're relying on people wanting to have the information that they need. So I think one thing that Facebook and Google can do better is helping local elections administrators flood the zone better. Get that reliable information out into people's news feeds, put that in front of their face so they can ignore it. And there's lots of things these companies can do to push information out instead of requiring people to opt in. In terms of the other question that your speaker raised, what do you do when disinformation comes from candidates on the ballot themselves, including in our context, the President of the United States? That's obviously a really difficult question to answer. It's something that all major platforms have struggled with. My own view on this is that no elected official and no one trying to become an elected official should be able to undermine their own accountability at the ballot box. I think Facebook, I think Twitter, I think Google need to draw a bright red line around election disinformation. Anything that interferes with the people's voice at the ballot box should be out of bounds. And I think that these companies eventually arrived at that as being a governing position, but I do think they need nonpartisan election officials, they need civil society organizations, they need journalists to hold them accountable for those policies. Because if elected officials can undermine their own accountability, that's how we lose democracy.
We have two questions from Mayet Janisha. How can we increase public confidence in democratic countries that the pandemic health restrictions are not a curtailment of the people's right to vote? How can we encourage citizens to participate in the electoral processes given the pandemic?
So there's two really quick answers that I would say. One, become part of the process. So in September, we launched a poll worker recruitment program to try to get younger people to become poll workers. So they see it from the inside and see that it's not this monolithic, scary, bureaucratic government entity just running the elections, that it's actually your neighbors and it's your grandmother and it's your aunt who are doing these sorts of things and trying to run the election. My mother has served as a poll worker for a number of years, and we convinced her this time around not to do it simply because she has underlying health issues, but she really wanted to do it. The other thing I would say is we emphasize 3 Ps: make a plan, participate, and be patient. Because of the pandemic, we knew that there were going to be longer lines, and for people to be patient with the overall outcome of it, because we knew that we were going to get an increased number of people participating. And so in 2020, more people than any time in our nation's history participated in voting. And so we were telling folks, you're not going to get your answers for the electoral votes on election night. It's usually an estimate to begin with, and it's not certified until 2 or 3 weeks later. So we were telling people that in order to count all the votes, the ones that were coming in, the ones that were being postmarked, that you have to be patient. And so I noticed on election night that a lot of the news stations lost their patience and were saying things like, oh, we're not going to know. Why won't we know? Because they reverted back to that. But you have to be patient. And those are the 2 things I would really emphasize.
There's a third question. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. In terms of making voters confident about participating and feeling safe at the polling place, I think this is another role that election officials can take on to show through the media what they are doing to ensure the protection of the poll workers and of the voters. I know that in some parts of the United States, election officials did a walkthrough with local journalists to show them what a polling place would look like, to show the hand sanitizer, the shields, the wipes, the other things that were in place. And so that ought to provide more comfort for voters, I think, who have some initial concerns.
So there's another question, just the last one from her. Has there been an increase in COVID-19 cases after the election?
Well, I don't know if there's an increase in it, but I would say that I wanted to thank everyone who served as a poll worker or election worker because they were putting their lives on the line just to basically participate in our democracy. I was going to say that we actually have a video of going back to the last question, and I'll ask our counsel, Phil, to post that in the chat box, of our chairman going to DC and being walked through their social distancing and their election process before their primary last June.
Okay, and just one last question before we wrap up the forum for me. How did the government in the US monitor online campaign spending? Is it something that you ask your candidates to separately declare? Is it something that you ask Facebook to help you compile?
I'm happy to speak to that. I mean, basically, all campaigns file reports with the Federal Election Commission. The data is a bit of a mess because campaigns, in essence, categorize that spending however they want. So you'll see like digital services, and that could mean a million different things. It could mean, running a data file, or it could be, creating a website and the like. What we've seen since 2016, though, is that Facebook, Google, Twitter have all developed greater transparency policies that now track spending on their respective platforms. However, one major challenge to that is that spending is not standardized across those companies. So what counts as electioneering communications on Facebook for Facebook's purposes is different than what counts as electioneering communications on Google for Google's purposes. Google is much more narrow. That accords actually with the Federal Election Commission definition. Facebook is much more expansive. So there's a lot of issues with respect to getting good numbers there, but at the end of the day, every campaign has to make its expenditures transparent to the Federal Election Commission. And that's one way that we track it, although the companies now are getting much better at figuring out how to make public transparency around specifically what's being spent on their platforms and for what purposes.
All right, so that wraps up our discussion today. I mean, unfortunately, we have very limited time for all the questions. I'm sure so many people would like to ask their own questions, but we lack the time. So for those who would like to send their questions, you can email them. And let me just take up the email. It's participate.asog@ateneo.edu. So if you want to ask our speakers questions, you can send those questions to that email, and Ateneo School of Government will try to get those questions to our speakers. So to wrap up our event, we will now call on Project Participate's Deputy Chief of Party, Ms. Lorraine Dorotan, to give her closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Pia. On behalf of the Ateneo School of Government, Project Participate, and our partners, I would like to thank all of you for attending the second leg of our Halalan 2.0, holding free, fair, and safe elections in the new normal. For today, we focused on how the U.S. conducted their election during the COVID pandemic. We would like to extend our deepest thanks to our reader speakers for their knowledge. Your presentations have given us confidence with proactive coordination and partnership between government agencies, organizations, medical professionals, and the citizens. We can work towards free, fair elections. As discussed by Commissioner Hicks, it was able to implement protocols to ensure that elections continued as planned in the midst of a global pandemic. Budget support, emerging voting technology, and a strong collaboration with civil society and government agencies were important in the conduct of the recent elections. A consistent information campaign that cascaded as well. Dr. Burden informed us forging strong working relationships within the government is critical. There were clear successes in how the U.S. prepared for the elections. Voter participation reached historic high, innovative solutions with high acceptance rates even for mail-in ballots. Dr. Kreiss' update on how the digital campaign methodology transformed the way politicians reach their voters also be key in our upcoming elections. There should be more coordination between political parties to discuss how campaigning should be conducted. This will lead to fair elections in an open playing field, and state and health officials should also be involved in the release of campaign activities, who will issue guidelines specifically to campaigns, and asking partners to adhere to it will be important. With our very own national and local elections less than 15 months away, we ask ourselves how we can start to prepare for COVID-proof elections. We have an opportunity and responsibility to participate in events such as this one to understand best practices, identify emerging issues and challenges, and collaborate with the Commission on Elections, policymakers, and society organizations to ensure our own elections. A balance of robust policies, strong measures, access to information, and citizen participation will be key. Through Project Participate, the Ateneo School of Government, in partnership with organizations such as the National Citizens Movement for Free Elections, the De La Salle University Institute of Governance, Ideals, and Code NGO, will be implementing activities aimed to strengthen citizen oversight and electoral process, enhance availability and accessibility of information to promote informing and support electoral and political reforms. As we enter the election season, we have a fresh opportunity to not only make history, but make an impact on our democratic institutions. I'd like to echo Commissioner Hicks and say that it's important for us to make a plan, participate, and be patient. It's time for us to work together and heed the call for a better future for our country. Again, thank you for attending Halalan 2.0, holding free, fair, and safe elections in the new normal. We hope to see you again.
All right, that wraps up our session for today. For those who want to catch the next session, it will be about the Singapore experience of holding elections under COVID-19, and that's happening next Wednesday, February 24 at 1 p.m. So if you want to register for that event, there's the link. And you can tell us about today's webinar, give us comment suggestions by leaving a comment on the Facebook live stream of Ateneo School of Government and Project Participate. So it's now 11:23. I'm sure if this were a physical forum, Ateneo School of Government would be hosting lunch for us. But for now, we just have to enjoy lunch on our own. So again, thank you everyone for joining. We hope you learned a lot. I learned a lot. I'm very excited to apply my learning to covering the elections next year. So again, there's a message from the organizers requesting for a photo op. So if everyone can just turn on their cameras or their video, their cameras, then you would like to have everyone for the group photo. So has everyone turned on their cameras?
Hold on.
Fix your hair, put on some lipstick.
Well, thanks for organizing this. This is great.
Okay, JM will take
Right.
the photo.
Yeah.
Is everyone ready? Okay.
Yeah. Is everyone ready? Okay. All right. Ready? 1, 2. For a while. Sorry. All right. One more. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Smile. One more. Hold on. Okay. 1, 2, 3. Smile. That's it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone, especially for speakers for joining despite the time difference, US and Philippines.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye now.
Goodbye.
Thanks.